Hello, also, it's what you serve meeting. We're testing remotely. Still can
There's not going to be one. This is awesome. Oh, that one works. Go for it.
Hi, so we are planning to have a STIR meeting here for the benefit of remote participants as soon as we can find a chair.
Does anyone have Russ Housley's phone number? Thanks.
Looks like we got the B, yeah.
I'm just gonna start these going because why not?
It's not like we're going to take this entire hour anyway, right? It's not like we have enough material for that, so.
Just to get some administrative stuff out of the way while we are waiting for the chairs, I'm going to start the blue sheets, and I'm going to give you a few moments to think about who really wants to be a minute taker for this meeting and who wants to sit in the jabber room and scribe. I'll be back in the microphone to take answers.
Answer yes by not running.
That work? It seems to have crashed the Meet Echo machine.
Right, that doesn't seem to be good. If anyone on Meet Echo is monitoring this, it would be good to have this taken care of. Okay, I'm back here now. Who wants to take minutes? Thank you very much, John. And Jabber scribes, just for taking information to and from the Jabber room. Ted, I saw you were in the Jabber room. Can I rope you into this? Okay. Yes, you can use your chip. Krister, can I compel you to just sit in the Jabber room describing for us? Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, this floor is very tricky if you're like used to using the south elevators.
So the screen there in the middle is showing exactly what I'm seeing up here, which is a white screen that says loading ... in very small characters in the upper left corner. So pressing the button doesn't do anything at the moment. Thank you. Well, as John points out, luckily we're not planning on filling the entire slot. If you want to just jump into your presentation and then have Russ do the... Oh, hey, something happened.
know if anybody actually uploaded anything to the fancy data tracker yet. Share slides. Okay, that's good.
Welcome to STIR. You should be familiar with the note well by now. If you're not, please pay attention. This has implications about how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to disclose IPR, a variety of other important things, and down near the bottom are the specific documents to talk about exactly how this works. So today, I've already got a minute taker driver's got blue sheets. We're going to be talking about, let's see, out of band, shaken, the divert draft, and RCD. Go ahead.
I think Chris will actually be doing RCD instead of me.
Okay, so that's bash number 1.
Any other bashes? Anything else people would love to discuss? Martin Dolly, I'm sure you have a 5-minute lightning talk you want to give. Okay. Okay. So I don't know if we actually have any of the other materials uploaded here, which, let's see if we can figure out how to do that real fast.
I think you need to be
log in. Yeah, I
shared
do the
up.
chair.
Are you sharing anything right now?
Yes.
I'm sorry, which is yes? Oh, they are uploaded, I suppose. Go ahead and see if we reload and see if they're up there now. Slides, it just says share
Or
slides.
share slides, Robert. Am I looking at the wrong thing?
Here we go.
Okay.
Hello, can anybody hear me?
We can hear you now.
I see that. GZIP, thanks.
Yes, you are looking at the wrong thing. Apparently, the agenda page is cached for a couple of hours. You need to go to the materials page for STIR. The link is in the Jabber room.
What's up here?
So the materials page for STIR is actually, oh, I see.
Quit using those.
Do you
buttons.
understand?
AV failure reasons.
Okay, these are all the slides are in this STIR GZIP or, wait, this, I see. There we go. Okay. We got it. Wizardry. Oh, that's a draft. That's not good.
So seriously, I'm trying to tell you how to get to where you want to go quickly.
I'm sorry.
Quit fighting.
I'm fighting. Let me see. So what am I doing wrong, Robert?
So grab your browser window, go to your URL bar,
Yeah.
type datatracker, IETF.org /group/stir/meetings.
Okay.
Hit enter. There's a
Okay.
material, scroll back up, right in, hit
Yeah.
that. That's
Got it.
what you should have been seeing on the main agenda page.
Got it. Correct you are. Okay. So this looks like what we want.
I assume we can get started. Okay, so this document is pretty close to being done. I got a few comments back that it probably would be good to go through, although I have responded on the list. So if you've been watching the list, you see similar comments, but I'll just go through them quickly. Next page. There was a request for some privacy considerations for a privacy consideration section. I provided text to talk specifically about Origin ID, to make sure there wasn't any confusion about Origin ID as a indicator that might expose something. It's important to recognize Origin ID is not does not have anything to do with the originator of a call. It's actually something that we put into Shaken as a unique, opaque, unique identifier, so that the service provider would have some way of tracing back to where the call was originated, not the originator themselves. I guess I recognize that that is somewhat confusing potentially, but suffice it to say, the intention really is there that this identifier, at least as it's defined in Shaken, is supposed to be opaque. There's and represent the origination of the call, and not the, so there's no personal identification being leaked with this.
So I think it was at my suggestion that you pointed into 3261 and 3323 at the front of this. I haven't gone to read what's in the base passport spec. I think, if memory serves right, you should just be able to point to that instead, and it will talk about all these other things.
So, okay, point to the base passport spec, and you did verify that it points to those?
I'm just going off memory.
I don't.
John was nodding his head.
Yeah, I think that's.
I mean, so to be honest, I mean, 3323, you know, the privacy properties that it provides probably aren't that well aligned with this particular issue anyway. I think what's more material to it would be, again, that the fact that this does not contain personally identifying information in any real way, right? This is something that is used as a very opaque identifier for network resources rather than people. And, you know, in the second place, that there are known countermeasures, right? If you're concerned about people tracking these things, you can just generate a new one that you, because this is basically internal to service provider networks, right? So like if there's one trunk that you're identifying with an Origin ID, you could, if you felt like it, like generate a different Origin ID that pointed to that same trunk every time you placed a call. So I think the aggregate of those two things probably closes any privacy gap I'd be worried about. It's worth, I'm sure, pointing in general to the security properties of 8225, to the passport base spec and that. But yeah, I think those two things really probably satisfy me anyway on it.
Yeah, John had provided that comment before this meeting. I'm happy to incorporate text like that as a suggestion to potentially get around any privacy concerns.
Yes, next slide.
Okay, next slide.
Whoop. Oh, is this the next one? Yes, this is the next one. Okay.
Yeah, this one should hopefully be pretty straightforward. There was a request to include some terminology definitions. The first one is verified association. It's something that's used is actually taken from the Shaken specs, but it's fine to define it here. And essentially it means, you know, some way that you can authenticate the user to make sure that they're initiating the call. And then, or actually the user's device, to be more specific. And then also there was a request to include a reference to passport and how it's defined in 8225. Any questions with this? Sounds good. Next page. And then there was also a comment I got specifically to describe in the abstract a little more contextually for what's being described in the document versus talking about like how it's coming from Shaken and IPNI and all that other stuff. And I actually agree with that. So I wrote some new text, giving a brief description of both the attest and Orig ID, the purpose of those, and what's described in the document. Any questions on that? Okay, good. So all the other comments were editorial. I have corrected all those in my local copy. I think based on at least the privacy section, I'll put a new version of that on the list. And then if I don't get any comments back, I'll release a N05. If that makes sense. Okay. That's it for me.
Thank you.
So I think,
Wait, Adam?
Yeah, Adam Roach is area director. So my plan then is to put this into IETF last call as soon as the 05 comes out, unless anyone has an objection. So, all right, I'm seeing some light nodding. I'll go with that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think it's me.
OOB's next.
Yeah, this converted so well from Keynote. Okay, I'll get up. Hi, so I have like virtually nothing to say about Divert, but I'll say a couple things anyway. I put up a couple slides that just give us an excuse to talk about it. Next slide, please. So for those of you that do not recall this document at all, it has been in working group last call here for a bit, and we did have at least some eyeballs on it. This is a document that is fixing a known kind of gap in storage capabilities in cases where there is call forwarding, basically, where the administrative domain that was the original target for a call wants to be able to tell you, nah, go somewhere else instead. And so we created this new div attribute. It's a new kind of passport, really. It has an interesting property that the entity that signs these passports is not signing based on its authority over the orig field in passport, the originator of the call, but instead over the dest. Because it's saying, yes, I was the destination for this call, and I'm telling you, instead, go talk to this guy. And this is useful to basically help verification services to understand why it is that a call reached them, right? To prevent a certain class of cut and paste attack where an attacker could just grab an arbitrary passport. You know, if Chris is trying to call me and somebody grabs that passport and instead sends a call to Martin claiming that they're from Chris, Martin can look at this and be like, this was to John, right? But of course, if Chris sends me an invite and I then generate this div passport, it'll show, yeah, I'm John, and I'm saying this call is actually supposed to go to Martin. So when Martin gets it, he'll go, oh, I see how that worked as a verification service. Everything works out fine. And you need to start a couple of use cases that actually matter. There's ways that local number portability is implemented in some areas that have this property. Free phone systems that convert to geographic numbers have this property. So it's actually kind of useful. A lot of people seem to want it. Next slide. So based on the enlightened guidance of Eric Berger at the previous IETF meeting, we have made nesting in this a must. That is to say that whenever you see a div passport, it's going to have within it the original passport encoded with this new opt element that we have defined for passport. We also made opt completely independent of div, so actually future extensions want to make use of having some original passport embedded inside a passport for some reason. They'll be able to just reference the specification to pick that up. There are a couple of other use cases that people have batted around where that might actually be useful. The one, of course, consequence of this, it's a trade-off, right? Previously, we're talking about doing this all with multiple identity headers, and then you'd have to try to figure out, okay, which one of these divs goes with which of these original passports. So now we no longer have any of the confusions that might arise from that, but what we have instead are really long passports. And so we want to make sure as this goes out into the wild that people appreciate long headers could be generated by this. I actually tried to mock up reasonably accurate examples of what those sizes were in this version of the draft, which I hadn't really previously done. And so you can kind of get a sense of what the hit of this will really practically look like. So that's what's new. This was what we agreed on last time. That's really the only major change that we made. There was a lot of minor textual places we previously talked about non-nested approaches that had to be extirpated. Next slide. So one issue that's come up relatively recently, thanks to the tireless work of the folks over at Addis trying to figure out all the conceivable use cases in which div might be used, and I've had many great conversations with Chris and Kate Hancock and others about this, is I guess a question that Dave and Chris raised to me about kind of pre-div solutions, where, you know, do we want to be able to have a signature available over request URIs as well as over the original 2 header fields in STIR? And my initial reaction to that was pretty much, well, I kind of think of a request URI as a more ephemeral, I guess, piece of contact information that gets associated with calls and frequently modified and things like that. But I think that, you know, the way that Chris phrased this that maybe made me see most why we might want to say something about it was, what do you do if you're an authentication service and you get a call that you're supposed to be signing that's been sent to you by some SIP UA, and the 2 in the request URI are already different? And you know, that you can't tell whether that difference reflects a semantic change, that is, that this is a different administrative domain, for example, than what the original 2 header field signified. Like, kind of how do you handle it, and what do you make of that situation? And this comes back to the kind of the core principles behind STIR. You know, we want to sign over the 2 header field in order to make it possible for verification services to have an idea of who the original caller was trying to reach, right? And whether or not they are, you know, that person or that administrative entity. And so, you know, I think that principle is a good one. And if we wanted to alter it, we'd have to go back into 4424, really, to alter it in 4425. This isn't something that's like specific to the div spec, and there's nothing we do in div that would kind of change that. And there is kind of a gap that opens in this too. If, for example, you were only signing over the request URI and not over the 2, which is one proposal that I heard. You know, then I think, you know, I can imagine a class of attacks where you want to say convince United Airlines that the original call number was, you know, 1-800-United-1, and that, you know, but you're only signing over the request URI, and that's what's in the DAST. And you could kind of just represent, oh, well, this had gotten securely redirected previously to you, and that there could be vulnerabilities that would open up from that. So my initial intuition on this anyway was that I kind of like things the way they are. I guess I kind of, I think div was created specifically to take care of these use cases where there was a change in the administrative domain that is semantically meaningful. And so I guess my thinking is I'm pretty comfortable with the way the mechanism stands now. But since this came up, and you know, I think people are concerned about what to do in that case, it might be worth like adding some language to the spec, to the div spec. It just kind of explains more why it works the way it does and why we don't want to change it to reflect this. But if anybody here wants to talk more about this use case or other use cases where maybe signing the 2 doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but instead signing the request URI or both. I mean, remember, DEST is an array, right? So we could sign both the 2 and the request URI in an authentication service. I'm not sure there's much value that when signing a request URI in the first place. But Chris, if you want to speak to it.
Yeah, I think, you know, it was sort of the free phone use case where the retargeting actually happens in the originating network typically, or at least in an intermediary network. That was the most discussed part of this, but I think, you know, after we discussed this, a light bulb went off in my head that it really is a different use case than the typical like call forwarding case where, you know, it's going from network to network versus, you know, the case where, you know, you're calling 1-800-United and it's just a geographic telephone number that's being retargeted to, and therefore the end consumer of that call knows that it's representing 1-800-United versus it's actually like a totally different telephone number that does need to be verified. So I think we just need to, well, in this draft, it'd be nice to talk about the differentiation between those 2 cases. And then I think on the shaken side, we do need to accommodate those cases just to make those clear.
Yeah, I mean, cases where the redirection or the retargeting has already occurred on the originating side, this is exactly what diversion, right, was created for back in the day, and we don't love diversion here in the IETF so much, but history info, right, is the mature version of that. And we have created these plugins that make div work with those things specifically for precisely this use case. So, I mean, I hope that it works. I mean, I can imagine an authentication service, right, that is privy to a dip that has been made to SMS 800 locally, even creating the whole like div, right? I mean, like, provided it can sign for it, like that's not in any way outside the realm of possibility. So, yeah, I mean, my preference would be, of course, that whoever is, fielding those SMS 800 queries actually, in turn, generates the full div for the call and sends it back. But I could imagine other architectures where that is much more internal to a network. So, yeah, I'm happy to add some text to talk a bit more about this. But this is, I think at this point, I'm confident the core, this would be descriptive text. The core mechanism, I think, is correct for this, right? I don't see what we'd change about the mechanism to reflect it.
Yep.
Which is good, because that would mean that, we should last call this and be done, right?
Go ahead, Robert.
So I want to weigh in as a +1 on not trying to change the mechanism to address protecting the request URI, especially if you take the case that you've that you're considering in Addis and simplifying it to a pure SIP network. If somebody steps in and hands you a SIP request that has a request URI that is wholly unrelated to the two, what does that mean for your signature? So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, we don't lay a lot of, constraints on what policy decisions authentication services and verification services make for good reason. I can imagine authentication services that would be upset about that, but I could also imagine ones that would say, I know why this is happening and I'm still confident signing the two, right? And so as long as you have the proper credential to sign for the two-header field, I can kind of see you still doing it in that case, but.
Chris Wine again. Yeah, I think we were trying to make all these things sort of generic, and this does add a little bit of logic there that makes it a little more complex, unfortunately. But I guess that's SIP in general.
Well, I mean, again, how these policy decisions get made, and I wonder if someday, because there's so much energy in this working group to take on new work, I can tell, but we could do a whole document that's like, here are some not insane policies for why authentication services and verification services should sign and, validate things respectively, and what we imagine they're going to present to the application, or ultimately they might get rendered to a user on the verification side as a result of receiving a valid passport. And that maybe there is more exact guidance than we give in 8224, because there's a bit of guidance in there, right? But it's very policy free. It's very much like, well, if the date is within like this threshold, this is what you should do, and things like that. But we very intentionally we're not going to say anything about why you sign or accept these things. If there was an appetite to explore that more, I think we would be getting into that territory very quickly if we started trying to answer the question, well, should an authentication service really sign a two-header field if the request that comes to it has a request URI that is radically different? I think I can imagine very good reasons for signing that, and I can also imagine policies where it'd be like, we shouldn't do that. Maybe even domain-specific ones, right? That's the point.
Yeah, I guess it's the exceptions that you can handle the request URI change, but any of the standard call forwarding scenarios, you should absolutely have a div. And
that's my preference. Yeah, my preference is that you are creating a div if you have, if this call has been forwarded, if there's a request URI that is radically different from from the original two-header field. That would be my preference, because it'll make it easier for a verification service to make sense of it when it actually ultimately receives the request. That's the whole idea behind doing this, is so you can have some assurance that this is not a cut and paste attack against you. See, look, we had some discussion. We had substantive discussion about div. I promised we'd have a little bit. Yeah, I think we're pretty close on this. I would say I'm comfortable last calling it as is. I'd always be happy to see more eyes on it. Eric actually caught a lot of just fumbled grammar and malformed ideas. So if other people feel like reading it during working group last call, that would be great.
Can anyone offer a reason why it's not ready for working group last call? Okay, we'll start it this week.
Thank you, gentlemen. Adam, you have something to share.
It's actually on the previous draft. So Adam Roach, as area director, again, I realized when I sat down that I had mixed some things up in my head, and the shaken draft has been through IETF last call already. We're not doing that again. No. What I meant to say is, as soon as the 05 comes out, we'll be putting it on an IESG agenda. So yeah, we're closer to the finish line.
That's what I interpreted your words to mean. So I was transferring the state myself.
I got some confused email on the topic, so I was like, yeah, I botched that. Thanks.
All right, next slide.
What is that?
This is the thing, like it got all like, I had it in PowerPoint, I converted it to Keynote, and then I had to mail it from anyway, I won't do that again. I have virtually nothing to say about this document. Next slide. It's called out of band. It's this document that's about the out of band stuff, about the notion that maybe some protocol other than SIP might have use for passports. This is an idea that I think we can't afford to ignore, given the fact that to date, not all telephone calls use end-to-end SIP. Next slide. So it's in working last call. Is it out of working last call? It's pretty close, right?
Yeah, I thought this did.
I think it may be complete around now, working group last call. Boy, there really was, some heated discussion about this in the list. I was receiving a lot of instant messages and texts, and there's some really interesting blog posts. Nobody had anything to say about this document, which is not surprising. I know that this is a pet cause of me, but our idea, of course, here was just to declare a victory without really specifying much more than a sketch of a mechanism, and to say, put a pin in it. We've kind of defined what the problem looks like, what the solution space looks like, and if a fire gets lit under this by someone who, say, wakes up tomorrow and realizes not all telephone calls use SIP, maybe we'll go spin something back up and use this for something.
To be clear, where we are, working group last call has been initiated a while ago, but we have not had the consensus call yet.
Okay. So we should probably have a consensus call that everyone here consents to the fact that nobody cares and we're going to bring this forward. Okay, that it's worth documenting. I think we got to that point on this, and but that it was not worth really driving it into a fuller mechanism at this point.
What I think the agreement coming out of Montreal was that we were going to publish this framework, but we weren't going to publish details of protocol instances that implement the framework.
Right. I don't know.
It's your last slide, right?
Yeah. If anybody wants to read this or talk to me about it, or suddenly say, hey, we really need this, I'll be waiting. I'll be carrying a torch for this. I will have a torch song for out of band.
I think we're about to make the consensus call on that. If there are any last minute issues, please post them immediately.
And I think that's it. I think Chris is going to talk about our CD.
I clicked the wrong thing. Rich call data, right? Oh.
Maybe with that. Okay, next page. So I guess we sort of wanted to, we had this rich call data thing and calling name and some things I'm going to talk about are important, and we didn't want to ignore it and wanted to get it updated and hopefully out fairly quickly because I think it's pretty straightforward. Next page. So in this update specifically, we included a mechanism for, well, we already had the RCD claim defined, which includes the name field, which is basically including the name that is included for caller ID. But we thought the issue, like, you know, thinking about including rich call data extension with a shaken extension, and I think in general, calling name or rich call data is going to be something that's combined with other potential extensions easily. We thought it would be nice to have a mechanism that would allow you to simply add this without having to define a sort of, like, I have an example here of a shaken plus RCD passport extension. So I think because this is probably going to be pretty commonly used, we thought, why don't we add the ability, if you support this specification, that you just add an RCD claim to your existing extension passport, and all of the rules that are defined in this document for interpreting that claim could be followed. It's just at the verification service, if it understands how to use the RCD claim, it can interpret it correctly. But if it doesn't understand RCD, then you can just simply ignore it, just like any other JWT in general. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions around that? Any comments?
Hey, it's John. The only thing I'd add to that is that for some of the third-party cases we discussed, there is still a use in defining a PPT type for RCD because it'll just operate with different passport rules.
Right, we didn't remove that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just an additional mechanism that we put into the document. Yep. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. I just included an example because I had used this for another presentation. So if anybody has any questions there, it's pretty straightforward. I just added the RCD. This happens to be a shaken example. Okay, next page. So I guess I wanted to also add something that has been sort of discussed in different forums, but and we haven't been proactive in getting this done, but I'd like to try to get this done. There's been a lot of chatting about using JCard as a way of transporting actual rich call data, so more than just the name. So I came up with this term, plain old calling name versus rich call data. Plain old calling name being, you know, the mechanism that we all know and love currently, where in the from or the paid you include the name. And that's well used in a lot of scenarios. So we don't want to change the mechanism, and that's all described in the current draft. But adding this new mechanism, perhaps defining it as a standard mechanism as well. So, but the only difference here is that rather than the typical including verifying the claim and then doing a string compare against what's in the existing SIP headers, you actually use the passport as the transport of the information. So, you know, just in particular for size reasons, to be honest, you would include the JCard in the as part of the RCD claim. and then, encode it and sign it, and then that would actually be the transport mechanism rather than repeating it in the SIP header. And as a result, I sort of have a note here that while compact and full form would be supported for the name, because we're transporting the information, only full form would be supported for that. Do you have a comment, Sean? Okay. Any comments, questions there?
Hey, it's John. So, yeah, I think so I think we definitely need it. And there are a couple of different ways to approach this. And probably we need to do a little bit of an exercise of figuring out how we want to approach that. Especially, and we've discussed this before, I know, whether we want to include something like a JCard by reference or by value. That is, if we want to have like a URL in there. The interesting thing about the URL is, of course, there are mechanisms in SIP to convey a URL, which gives information about the call in general that could, be repurposed for that. And you could actually sign that compact form style rather than actually including it in the passport necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a couple of trade-offs like that of different ways you might approach it that are probably interesting and that we should kick the tires on a bit. Totally agreed. We would want to put like the whole JCard like into a SIP request, and then you just do the signature over that in STIR, in Passport. But I could see if you're using a URL-based approach to including the JCard, that could in fact be in a separate SIP header, and then that could be signed in compact form. And I think another virtue of doing this by reference rather than by value is it does allow more flexibility if there are formats other than JCard, say, that people are interested in for this. And I haven't conducted that particular beauty contest myself of what I think is the best thing to express the qualities of a caller. But that might give us basically just some modularity to be able to plug in different things.
So this is Russ. We have experience where a certificate contains a URL, and people are realizing that's a longer lived thing than a passport. But when that is done, often you will see a URL followed by a hash. So that way, if you choose to chase the value from the URL, you compare what you got to the hash, and that way the signer and the validator are both using the same dereferenced value.
Yeah. I mean, even in flight, while a SIP call is in flight, you could imagine things about the JCard changing, right? And that could be surprising to the entity that generated the passport.
Just a follow-up question to the point that Russ just made. I'm a little confused of what security property you think would be important in that when we're talking about something like a URI to a logo. Clearly, there are long-lived logos that you might be using as identifiers to say you're talking to the service that you want to do. But there are also, in most of these cases, some form of content negotiation possible, either based on where you dereference it or their presumptions about what your user agent is capable of displaying. And of course, that means that all those hashes, which might have been to some canonical version, either have to be each included or you get a lot of failure modes. So I appreciate that in certificates having these, there's potentially a value, but the rich call data, I'm not sure that the value is exactly the same. And so I would be hesitant to do that unless you were quite sure that for the elements which you wanted to do a URL and a hash, that the nature of the object being dereferenced was sufficiently static that these hashes were going to last as long as the passport itself did.
So John started his comment by saying there are other places in SIP where we do this. And so I was responding to that, thinking that if we're going to build a mechanism that's more general, let's be cognizant that we want to make that some of them will have the situation where the signer and the validator need to be sure they got the same object.
I agree. And I think that the question you really then come to is, where's that line between
Correct.
the ones you wanted and the ones where you definitely do not?
Exactly.
And I guess the question is, would that go into this document if you want to include this mechanism, or would it go into a more general one that addresses the use of URLs in SIP?
Well, right now, the document has passed the whole value. There's no issue. It's only
Yeah.
if we choose to support some things that are passed by reference. And then if it's only the RCD, I don't think there's an issue. If we go beyond that, we need to make sure that that template isn't applied inappropriately to other things.
That certainly makes sense. Ted Hardy again. That certainly makes sense to me, and I appreciate the caution there. I'd also suggest you probably want to limit the kinds of URL schemes which are permitted here in the same way that SIP itself does, because a mismatch there seems particularly problematic.
One note to consider also is JCard itself can have URLs inside of it. So
Ted Hardy again, but that's actually quite different, right? Because you're going to sign the JCard as an assemblage. You're not going to be trying to guarantee anything about the particular objects which are dereferenced. You're merely saying that this is what was presented as the JCard, right. And the results of that and the results of trying to sign the dereferenced value, if you're incorporating it by reference, actually are pretty different in a lot of these situations.
It's John again. I mean, I'll really, it's just me trying to get compact form back, right, for this is why I'm here. Because I am worried about the size that these things are like growing to, right? And if it's like a shaken passport, right, that we're then adding RCD to, and, it's got there's a div, like anything we can do to like cut the passports down, I think. I'd like to at least preserve a way to do that. And so this could be something where we allow both by reference and by value, right? That I think would be fine with me. And yeah, by reference may have some edges on it. We want like e-tags or hashes or whatever. Yeah. It's just some kind of a versioning system for the content that's on the other side of it. But yeah, in general, I'd like to try to find a way to get compact to work with this if we can.
Yeah, and I have no opposition to, and in fact, I like including that. And I think it's too early to know what the industry will do or prefer to do, but I certainly could see a future where all JCards are dereferenced through a URL, for sure. I think we actually talked through some of this stuff. I just mentioned here proposing JCD as a name. And I did make a reference to the security or verification of logos by URIs, which we just discussed. So I think other than that, I'm done.
Okay, any last questions for Chris? Okay, that was our last agenda item, and we wrapped up with 7 minutes to spare. So, thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Just that sometimes people can't find enough.
originally outlined